Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The widening gap between the United States and Ukraine became more evident this week. Late Tuesday, the U.S. president shocking the world by blaming his Ukrainian counterpart for starting the war with Russia. To be clear, it was Russia that broke international law by launching a full-scale invasion of a sovereign neighbor. That was back in February of 2022, and with it, unleashing the largest conflict in Europe since the Second World War. Still, that fact did not stop Donald Trump Wednesday, who doubled down on his rhetoric, turning to social media and saying the following about Volodymyr Zelensky. Quote, "He refuses to have elections. He's very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections, Zelensky better move fast, or he is not going to have a country left." In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. "I love Ukraine," says Donald Trump, "but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died." And so it continues. Again, that quote from the U.S. president. And the United States is negotiating with Russia, with their respective officials meeting in Saudi Arabia this past week and agreeing to appoint teams to negotiate a settlement to the war. But notably absent at those talks, any representative of Ukraine or a representative from the European Union. Zelensky has said Kyiv would not accept any deal negotiated behind Ukraine's back, and upon hearing Trump blame Ukraine for the war and attacking him personally, Volodymyr Zelensky said the words originate from a Russian disinformation campaign, and, quote, "Unfortunately, Trump is living in this disinformation space." So what impact does all this have on the war and on Ukraine? Well, recently I did sit down with the Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv, and here now is our conversation in Profile. So as you and I sit down for this conversation, the talks in Riyadh have wrapped up, and at the table were representatives of the United States, of Russia, not Ukraine, not any other European country. How does Kyiv view these talks in Riyadh?
I think, Ukraine is very clear from the very beginning that, first of all, we as Ukrainians want to have peace as nobody else. That is up to Russia to end the war by, taking their troops out of Ukraine's sovereign territory. But also, if we look on the peace in Ukraine, the key component of this peace is this peace to make just and lasting. And that's why the conversations needs to include Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, because what Russia launched back almost 3 years ago, the full-scale invasion into the sovereign, independent, democratic country, is also the huge threat and the biggest conventional war in the European continent since the Second World War. So today, Ukrainian men and women in the uniform are protecting eastern flank of Europe and the whole Europe. So it's also a part of the European security, and we believe that Europe needs to be also a part of the negotiations.
So Ukraine needs to be at the table, Europe needs to be at the table, as you say, although when we hear U.S. state officials describe this meeting, they see it almost as a test, if you will, to see if there is the potential for more meaningful negotiations between the U.S. and Russia on several matters, including Ukraine. Is that a hopeful or a concerning statement to hear?
Look, we see the reality on the ground, and we see what Putin is doing. If we look on Russian military machine, this year, Russian war budget is increasing 25% in comparison to the last year. Russia continues to conscript new soldiers, and this year they will increase their army for additional 150,000 of troops. So today Russia is, building and continue to build their war machine. And as from the very first day, said Russia can stop this war today if they want. But from what we are seeing, Russia continues not only to build their military capability, not only to increase their army, but they are continuing with the attacks on Ukraine. But we learned it from the history. There are many cases where Russia was directly lying. First, it was Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine had the third biggest stock of nuclear weapons in the world. We refused from that, but also we got so-called guarantees. They just left on the paper because Russia was one of the guarantors for territorial integrity, for sovereignty of Ukraine, which remained a piece of paper. Then we had Minsk I, then we had Minsk II. We had already in our history different types of negotiations on the high level, Normandy format. Actually, Russia breached everything from that time. And now, learning from these lessons of the history, there is a way to provide the security guarantees. Without them, this peace won't be sustainable because Russia does not demonstrate the willingness for stopping the war.
Okay, and so as you say, there is a history of Ukraine making concessions, thinking that in making those concessions, Ukraine would have territorial integrity guaranteed from countries, including Russia. But here you now have a U.S. administration, Donald Trump, even before elected, saying that he wanted to see an end to the war. Are you afraid that whole history is lost on the U.S. president?
I think, U.S., as President Trump said, and there was a meeting between President Zelensky and Vice President Vance in Ukraine. There will be the visit in the coming days, actually this week, of the special envoy, General Kellogg, to Kyiv. We share, the idea and the desire for peace and just and lasting peace. But that is the way and how to achieve this peace and how to achieve the way that this peace will be sustainable. And there are actually quite a straightforward way. It's actually Ukraine becoming a NATO member. This is what Ukraine was desiring for many years, but what changed since the start of the full-scale invasion is actually that today, first, Ukraine has one of the strongest army in the European continent, one of the biggest army, which has, the capacity to be cooperative with all the other NATO forces because we are using NATO standard weapons. Many of thousands of our troops have been trained in NATO standards. Actually, in Canada, highly contributed to that. And this is not only the kind of an easiest way to ensure this just and lasting peace. But, pragmatically saying, it is the cheapest way to do it. Because what is the other alternative? The other alternative is to build in Ukraine the deterrence capabilities, which is strong army, which is presence of European, US, and other allied troops in Ukraine to guarantee the security, building robust defense sector. And this could be also an option, but definitely it will require more resources in comparison to just, inviting Ukraine to become a NATO member.
So I hear the argument you're making that the fastest way to make sure this doesn't happen again is to bring Ukraine into NATO. However, we know that from the Russian president, he says that any end of violence between the two countries must be accompanied by a guarantee that Ukraine is never allowed into NATO. And we have heard U.S. officials essentially say that NATO membership needs to be taken off the table in order for these talks to move forward. So what's your response to that?
I think the first question we need to ask all of ourselves, why Putin has his voice here? Why Putin can dictate the strongest democratic alliance in the world, which is NATO alliance, what to do or what not to do. And I think, understanding that NATO was built as a strong deterrence alliance to deter any of the risk of aggression. And NATO for years had the concept of open door policy. So the question is, why dictator who literally went through, breached almost every possible international rules and orders can have a voice to dictate what to do or not what to do. For us, it's Ukraine's desire to become a NATO member. It's backed by Ukrainian people, who in their high majority support that. It is also backed by our constitution, where Ukraine's aspiration to become an EU member and to become a NATO member is clearly stated. And it's also, once again, pragmatically saying, and what President Zelensky said over this weekend in his speech in the Munich Security Conference, that it's a right time to start thinking about the joint European forces, where Ukraine could be a significant contributor to the strengthening of security in Europe.
Which is an idea being floated around. But when you ask the question, how is a Russian dictator allowed to have so much say at the table? It is because the United States is trying to pursue a normalization of relationships with Moscow. So does Ukraine feel abandoned right now as the United States looks at a bigger picture, Ukraine just being a part of it?
Look, Ukraine is fighting the war. Ukraine is protecting, I think, all of us in terms of protecting democracy. I think what Ukraine shares the view with the United States that peace through strength is the way how to achieve it, because you can't talk with the dictators and make like concessions at the beginning with this negotiation. And of course, the President Zelensky made a very clear position that any of the talks behind Ukraine back is acceptable for Ukraine, and that's very clear for us. And I think we
is
feel
not acceptable for
is
Ukraine.
not acceptable for us, of course.
I do also have to ask, because another condition for ending the war for Russia, and this is from the Russian president, he says in order for the war to end, Ukraine must recognize Russian-occupied territories in your country. Is Ukraine willing to accept that as a condition to end the war?
How you can imagine it? He brought tanks. First, back in 2014, they brought so-called Green Men. They occupied Crimea. They occupied part of Donetsk and Luhansk region. Now with Russian tanks, missiles, and troops, not only Russian troops, but also North Korean troops, and with the Iranian drones, they occupied part of Ukrainian territory. Of course, if you look on the bigger picture, strategically Putin lost this war. And we need also to be very clear on that, because we all remember back 3 years ago, what were the expectations of many of our partners and allies? That Kyiv will fall down in days, in weeks, and there could be, the reality of Russian troops marching over the parade around March. It never happened. Yes, we sacrificed a lot with the people, was the lives lost, was the huge damages and the huge loss to the country, but we are sovereign, independent, and democratic country. If you ask the question about the territories, how can we live in the world where the borders can be redrawn by a dictator with the military power? In what world then we will end up living? And what will be the lesson learned from other dictators? Do we want to turn this world into the military chaos? And do we want to turn the governments of our countries only focusing on the military spendings, on the defense, because this is the only way to protect the countries? Probably the very obvious question is no. The other thing that we all need to understand, there are the people living there. There are millions of people living in the occupied territories. And it's not only the piece of land, it's our citizens. Many of them have been tortured, have been deported. More than 19,000 of Ukrainian children have been forcefully deported to Russia. They have been put into the so-called Russian families, to orphanages. We see what Russia has been doing in occupied Crimea with our indigenous people, Crimean Tatars. They are oppressed, they are imprisoned. Some of them including the young children like age of 16, 17, they are forcefully being sent to the military camps to be trained and then in the future to be sent to the front lines to fight against their, brothers, sisters, the same Ukrainians. So how we can, forgive or say like, look, people there, we won't fight for you. How then these people will survive this horror, what is happening on this occupied territories?
So what's your reaction then when you hear last week the new U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth say that Ukraine cannot hope to restore sovereignty over its whole territory? It seems that going into this, the United States is looking at surrender of territory as a foregone conclusion.
Look, there are different ways how we can regain these territories. One way is by military, another way is diplomatically, but Ukraine will never recognize, that this is not our territories.
Even if the United States says your country cannot hope to restore sovereignty over all the territory.
How we can recognize it? How we can say that these are the sovereign borders of the sovereign country, and then we'll say, no, it's not our territory. That's impossible.
But also reality now is a U.S. administration with the president expressing fatigue at giving military aid, financial aid to Ukraine, in his first term describing NATO as obsolete. Does Ukraine need to prepare itself to defend its borders without the help of the United States?
Look, I think, there are a few of the things which, which is quite true. If you look on the defense spendings for many of the NATO members, they are far from reaching the minimal commitment of 2%. So whether, this is the call also for all of the other allies to increase defense spendings, yes, because they haven't met the targets, which was set back almost 10 years ago. And this is the important part that need to be proceed. We also hear from U.S. administration the desire to bring peace. And the thing is, I think here we share the desire to bring the just and lasting peace. And of course, we need U.S. support. U.S. support is essential as much as the support of EU, as much as support of Canada, because if you look on overall, the supply of different types of the weapons, we increased ourselves, so from like 35 to 40% of the weapons which is now used on the front line is now Ukrainian produced. Europe and US support the other part, and it is initial, and it is important for us so that all our transatlantic allies will continue to support us. And I think it's not in the interest of any of our allies that Ukraine will be weakened.
Now, the United States has opened the door for continued support of Ukraine with an eye to Ukraine's critical minerals. How much access is Ukraine willing to give the United States in order to have the continued backing of the U.S. military?
And you know that Ukraine is a country which is rich on critical minerals, and today, as the world is looking on the reliable source of different types of the critical minerals, of course, Ukraine is open for the investors to help us to develop these critical minerals, and
U.S. investors in particular? And
U.S. investors definitely as well. We are welcoming to participate in the development of the critical minerals, because it's also a part of the economic strengths, and it's also a part of the Ukraine's rebuilding, because the investments that can come into the critical mineral sector, that will be a significant support for our economy, which will create the jobs in the country. So it's also like a win-win strategy. And of course, we are open to that option. And as we are speaking, the teams are working on this partnership in the critical minerals sector.
What does Ukraine need out of those talks on critical minerals with the United States in order to move forward? Is it simply a military guarantee, or are you looking for something else from the United States?
I think it's a part of the bigger kind of discussion in terms of the security guarantees as well, because security guarantees for us, it's not only like troops on the ground, it's not only the supporting of Ukraine troops, because we still have one of the biggest army today, and it will continue to stay big, because the reality is that Russia is our neighbor, and we need to be strong, and we need to have this deterrence. The second pillar is a strong defense sector, where we continue to build a lot of joint ventures and cooperation between our NATO member countries and their industries, and we are very successful on this. I think we are today, I won't be probably too modest to say, but we are #1 drone producer in the world, and we are one of the leaders on the edge of the new technologies, which are in the military sector, including with all of UAVs production. But also the third pillar is economic strength, because if you look on the cost of the overall damages on Ukraine's economy, infrastructure, which Russia has brought to us, we are talking about over $400 billion of the losses. And I think as we are speaking and the attacks continues, these figures are only growing. So definitely we need the investors to come. We need not only the governments from our partners to help us, but also there will be a significant role of the private sector to step in and to invest in Ukraine and to make this a win-win project. And the critical minerals with the U.S. companies participating in that, this is one of the pillars of the broader concept of the security, where economic security is a big part of it.
Canada, of course, has been a very strong supporter of Ukrainian efforts ever since the invasion, again, nearly 3 years ago today. We are going to have a different prime minister in a few weeks' time, and we may soon have an election there afterwards. What does Ukraine need from Canada, regardless of whoever succeeds Justin Trudeau as prime minister?
We definitely count that the support to Ukraine will continue from Canada. So whether it's in the first, the first and the at most is the continue the military support to Ukraine, because Canada played a significant role for training our soldiers, for training Ukrainian pilots, for supplying Ukraine with the NASAM system, air defense system, supplying Ukraine with the top-notch products of Canadian defense industry. And I've just 3 weeks ago was visiting many of the defense facilities in Canada who are producing armored vehicles, different types to Ukraine and the other types of the armor. And I saw how it's making this impact, including on Canadian companies. First, it's created jobs for them. And I was meeting with a lot of the people who have been working there, and I'm really very grateful because all of them, they shared with me their work for the big purpose. So they are proud that they are part of this project, and they can, in this way, provide their support to Ukraine. Another important thing is that it also is leading to innovations, and it's also leading to the more of development of this industry here, because it's not only that they supply something to Ukraine, it's often the two-channel, because we are providing the feedback. They are improving their products, their technologies. And last year,
so you're making the argument that in supporting Ukraine, Canada has benefited as well.
Of course we see it, because now many of the companies are interested to do the joint ventures with Ukrainian companies, because they, especially when we are looking on the spheres which are very technological, like as I mentioned to you, UAV, electronic warfare, where, for example, we are today using AI on the battlefield. There is no better place where you can test your technologies, where you can upgrade them, where you can test them in a real battlefield. And last year, when there was a big defense conference here, I saw a lot of types of the weapons on which there was the slogan, tested in Ukraine, tested the real battlefield and the flag of Ukraine. So now for Canadian producers, it's also a way to upgrade their products to be competitive on the markets, to go to other types of the market. Because if, for example, Canadian light armored vehicles in Ukraine are one of the best and they have a really good feedback, it's the other countries are looking at them. The other countries are started to buy them. So it's also a win-win on building this. And it's not only what Canada is doing. All of Germany, Denmark, UK, many other countries are already establishing their JVs in Ukraine and understanding that this is the way how they can boost their production, boost their product, and become more competitive.
So a call for Canada to continue its support of Ukraine, a call for Europeans to continue their support of Ukraine. But up against that still are these talks and this desire of the United States to end this war with Russia. So quickly running out of time, but I want to end our interview by a simple question. Are you hopeful in this moment, or are you worried?
We Ukrainians, we're always very realistic on what is happening. You need to understand, we are constantly living 3 years in a wartime. Under the missile attacks, under the drone attacks, under the huge disinformation campaigns that Russia is doing, and don't underestimate this, what Russia is doing, and I really expect they will even boost their efforts to share the panic and to share the narrative that, as they've done many times, even for these 3 years of the war, Ukraine is weak, everybody will, abandon Ukraine. This is also a part of that Russian warfare. So we are very pragmatic, we are very realistic, and we continue to fight, and we continue to closely work with our partners on bringing just and lasting peace.
And that was Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Yuliya Kovaliv. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next edition of Profile.